My name's Sheridan Broadbent. I'm an independent director and have a background in contracting internationally and domestically, and also more recently working in government in the utilities sector and large asset owners, so this is an issue actually quite close to me. Look, we've got an action-packed session. We're running a bit late on time, and I appreciate that we're between you and lunch. But this is a really fascinating and in many ways, as New Zealander, a really shocking case. And I think one that every New Zealander should be exposed to in some way, because a lot of people don't believe this goes on in our country. I want to introduce you very briefly to our panel. We've got Cam Moore, who's the National Manager of Investigations for Immigration New Zealand. Next to him is Sharyn Titchener, who's the Manager of the International Child Protection Unit for Oranga, Tamariki, the Ministry for Children, and also Natalia, who we've just met, who is an academic and human rights practitioner. So the three of them are going to take us through this case. If we have time for questions, I'll facilitate those from the floor. So I'd like to kick off with you. Welcome, Cam. Thank you.
Nā mihi. Nei rā, te mihi mahana kia koutou katoa. It's my pleasure to be here today. I get the privilege of trying to reduce a 3.5-year investigation into about 7 minutes. So you'll have to bear with me. I'm going to be very high level. And we're going to go through things fairly quickly. So, Operation Star was the code name for this investigation, for those of you who might not be aware of it. It's centred around a New Zealand resident, Samoan national, Joseph Matamata. He's a 65-year-old male that resided in Napier, Hastings. It resulted in a 5-week trial, New Zealand's second ever trafficking convictions and first ever human slavery convictions, and that occurred in March last year. So I've got 4 kind of main areas that I'll talk to, and just to give you a bit of background as to how this all started. So back in 2017, January, in fact, one of the senior investigators at the time was sitting in the front row of this conference. We were called down to an issue where 2 Samoan nationals who were unlawful, they overstayed their visas, had been picked up by our compliance officers, our uniform compliance officers. They were interviewed as part of a potential deportation process, and as a result of that, we highlighted and discovered elements of potential serious exploitation and trafficking. We sent 2 senior investigators down to take a more thorough statement of them, and indeed located what we believe to be 2 victims of trafficking. As a result of that, and very early on in the piece, we looked to our brothers and sisters in the New Zealand Police to do a joint investigation, and beyond that, and very quickly to Oranga, Tamariki, to MFAT, to MOJ, and a whole wide range of other services, including Labour Inspectorate within MBIE, to get across this in a very collective and collaborative manner. So I've spoken about the defendant, effectively the how. What was the sell? So our defendant went to Samoa. He was a self-appointed chief from Matai. He used that position as influence and control, and to gain, for want of a better term, mana. He would go to his village and then villages around him and sell a dream to the people that were over there. He did that by offering money, saying that they could come over and earn good wages, by relying on his status, by promising them free accommodation, and by effectively preying on family members or familial contacts. They all came over on visitor visas, so there were no work visas involved here. And when they got here, they had 3 months to stay, but as you'll hear later, they stayed for much longer than that. So their overall effort was they wanted to provide for their family, quite simple, and to get ahead and to do the very best that they could. Onshore, the reality was far, far different. So there was power imbalance, there was isolation, there was serious exploitation, there was physical, emotional and psychological abuse. And I'll talk about that very briefly a little later on. So what did they do? As soon as they arrived in the country, they were put into horticulture and viticulture orchards, picking fruit or pruning trees. They did that from day one, 12 to 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. And when they got home, they also served domestic duties for Mr. Matamata and his family. That included concreting driveways, which took 3 months. It included serving all the meals. They had no real rest. They were paid nothing for the time that they were here. Some, at very, very odd occasions, were given $20, but that was it. So the victims, we had 13 victims. Those victims spread across a 24-year period. The first group of victims were 1994, and the very end group were 2016. There were 12 males, 1 female. They ranged in age from 12 through to 54 at the time of offending. As I said, they had familial connections, so some of them were cousins, nieces, nephews. There were brothers and sisters within the victim group. As we saw and heard earlier, very common kind of themes in terms of the victims and how they were preyed on. So they had limited education, they came from subsistence living. They had very, very little travel experience, no skills in English, limited skills in their native tongue. They knew nothing about travel, immigration in New Zealand, or they had no family connections in New Zealand, which was important in terms of the control factor. The impact on the victims. So they worked continuously. They stayed in New Zealand between 18 months and 4 years was the longest. That was preyed on and persecuted against in this type of environment. They were under severe control. They could not speak to others. They were kept within effectively a locked perimeter fence within Mr. Matamata's property. They had no contact outside. In fact, some of the family members in Samoa actually believed that their family had died. They did not know where they were. When they went outside, they were always chaperoned, and their travel outside was always very, very limited. They suffered a high level of physical, emotional, and psychological abuse. They were up at 5 o'clock in the morning, singing the national anthem, standing to attention. They were fed scraps. They were fed rotten food, and Mr. Matamata would check to make sure those plates were empty before they went about their other domestic duties. They were akin to victims that I've seen in my previous enforcement career of sexual assault victims to the highest order. They were absolutely preyed upon and done so in an inhumane manner and were treated like slaves. Some of the investigation challenges that we had in this field, I think it's important for us to all recognise trafficking investigations are not a simple matter. They are complex, they are difficult, they take a lot of time. That comes down to a number of factors, but some of those include language, they include culture, and they include the level of control that these type of offenders are able to apply to the victims. And if we've heard anything, we've heard globally that this type of crime is really a hidden crime because of those factors. The victims actually didn't see themselves as victims. They weren't aware of the crimes, they saw it as a bad kind of experience. When we started this investigation, all but 2 of our victims were offshore and had returned to Samoa. Many described it as simply just a bad experience. One of the challenges we had was the familiar links. How do we go and speak to these victims knowing that they're linked to the defendant, Mr. Matamata, and will that prevent them from speaking to us? But we were able to identify matriarchs within the extended family and groups who really came on board and assisted us, as did, I have to say, the Samoan authorities, both the police and Samoan officials offshore. And I guess the biggest factor for us was, one of the biggest was they were overseas, so it required a number of trips to Samoa, and a very, very long period of time, resource and expense to gather the evidence that we need to gather to get this prosecution delivered. Just finally for me, and I think my time's okay, so where are we now? So we've had the convictions. Within that, and in terms of remedies, I think that Natalia touched on before, Mr. Matamata was ordered to pay $215,000 in terms of reparations to the victims, which is life-changing for them. We are currently within an appeal setting. Both Crown and Defence have appealed the convictions against Mr. Matamata and the sentence. That is due to be heard around 28 April this year. We're obviously hoping for a very positive outcome, and one of the things that we want to do more than anything is to be able to release that money to our victims so they can gain some mana, some respect back, get paid for what they were owed, and move on. Amen.
Thanks, Sharyn.
Yes, thank you, Pam, and thank you, Sharyn. I have been asked to comment on how this particular case, how it fits into what's happening elsewhere and globally. So just as a disclaimer, I was not involved personally in the case, but I have followed it closely. And we have heard today the world estimates of slavery is around 40 million around the globe. Now, these are only estimates, and I'm happy to go into the details of how we extrapolate the data into what we can identify as being slavery cases and therefore what it means in practice. Some of the estimates also suggest that there are around 3,000 people kept in slavery in New Zealand. Yet again, we can have a conversation and debate whether they are accurate figures or not, but I would say that they sound proportionate to the population. So this is, again, we are a relatively small nation with a small number of people in comparison to some other nations, hence, the number of 3,000 might not sound as a big number, but I always say in some circumstances, and that definitely is the case, one is too many. So how does it fit with the general understanding of those kind of cases? It's something we had a conversation prior to it. And if anything, I do want to acknowledge and law enforcement authorities in New Zealand need to be applauded for the work they've done, because such cases are so notoriously difficult to prosecute. And this is predominantly going to the evidence, to being aid and witnesses. And something Cam has touched on, and this is global experience of victims often not seeing themselves as victims that do not want to cooperate with the authorities for various very complex reasons, including that they might be traumatized. They might be ashamed of what happened to them. They might fear they will be expelled, extradited from the country. They might be afraid of their own safety, often life, or the loved ones be left behind in a homeland. So there are very complex issues that play a role here, including something that we only recently kind of grasping with, which is the concept and the practice of trauma bonding. So we're talking here about a vicious circle of abuse, devaluation, dehumanization, and reward, which creates very strong bond between the exploited and the exploiter. Something that undoubtedly has played a role in Mr. Matamata's case as well, because based on what we've heard, because people often ask the question, how is it possible that something of this sort, with involving that many people, happened over such long period of time? And for those victims, it's not just simply deciding I am a victim and tomorrow I'm gonna speak with the authorities. Again, for victims who are coming from other countries, which they do distrust law enforcement authorities, that's yet another difficulty. That's yet another barrier they have to cross. Not to mention all other barriers that we already mentioned, including the language issue. The other important factor, and that has been mentioned both in the media, and there have been lots of discussion about it. I'm not going to specifically talk about Samoan culture, also in respect of the fact that Mr. Matamata's case is currently under appeal, but I'm going to comment on what I refer to as the culture factor. And what I mean by it is the expectation and often pressure put on individuals to perform according to or in line what would be considered to be a culturally required, the control, right? And the question is not whether some cultures permit it more than some others, because based on global research that's been done, all cultures have forms of exploitation. That's not the question. The question is whether culture permits or condones this kind of behavior, whether that kind of behavior is normalized. And I think that the best way to explain it is to perceive labor exploitation as a form of a continuum or scale. On one end, we're looking into violation of labor standards. And then as we're progressing on that scale, we're going into more severe forms of workers' rights violation. And then we go to the very end of that scale, which is the extreme forms of exploitation. This is where modern slavery sits. And obviously, something that was mentioned earlier, modern slavery, it's a bit of an umbrella term. It includes human trafficking, it includes forced labor, it includes debt bondage, but also other forms of exploitation which are not, strictly speaking, relating to labor as such. So they do include something like forced marriage or organ trafficking. And so when you look at the individual country's level, depending on what the standards, labor standards are in each country, what would constitute a violation of a labor standard will differ between countries. But the further you go on that scale to the very extreme forms of exploitation, this is actually where globally there is a less variation. Most nations would find these extreme forms of exploitation as both morally and often legally unacceptable. So we can talk about at what point, what is the threshold, but ultimately, for all cultures, that extreme forms of exploitation it's not seen as acceptable. And finally, we touched on it on a number of occasions today. Do we in New Zealand require a modern slavery? And I'm going to say legislation as opposed to the act, for various reasons, according to what Dennis has mentioned. Because what's happening in the legal space globally is that realization that if you have just, and I don't want to say undermine the challenge of having modern slavery legislation, because it's very important, but if you just simply focus on one aspect of what is extremely complex social as well as legal, economic, etc. issue, then you kind of can miss out on the bigger picture. And so I do applaud the government, the fact that it has already made pledges to have Modern Slavery Act. It has made pledges to ensure that migrant workers in New Zealand are not exploited, so there are various channels and means by which that can be achieved. But I would like to encourage the government, civil society, and everyone else to look beyond New Zealand and beyond migrant workers in New Zealand. Because ultimately, those 40 million slaves all around the world, and part of them being, being part of the global supply chain, are directly or indirectly there because of us. So it is not simply a matter of us pushing the problem elsewhere or saying this is what's happening globally, it's not our problem. It is my problem as a consumer, and it should be our problem as businesses in New Zealand. So we not only focus on exploitation that happens in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but also exploitation that happens elsewhere in the world to which we ultimately contributing. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you all. It's pretty sobering stuff, and what amazes me here, and perhaps this is a question for you and Cam, Sharyn, because you see this, it just seems incredible that over a period of beyond 20 years, no one noticed What are the signals that we should look out for as consumers, as employers, as asset owners that might lead us to believe that something like this is going on? And I'll get you to use the microphones when you answer the questions because we're recording. So
yeah, no problem. So, look, I think they've been touched on already broadly by the speakers before us. So, 24 years is a long time for this type of offending to go on, and I think one of the reasons for it is education and awareness, if I'm honest about it. The plan of action and what we're seeing now over the last 5 years has seen an exponential growth in understanding, not only through society, but also law enforcement, government agencies, and the judiciary in terms of what modern slavery may look like, can look like, and in fact does look like in New Zealand. But if you're looking at triggers and you're looking at factors that may be involved, the things that we've seen, and we've seen it through the investigations and prosecutions we've done, both in exploitation and trafficking, passports taken, a high level of control over the victims. In this particular case, they were kept separate from all other work groups on the orchards for very obvious reasons. They were not allowed outside of the house. When they went to church, and they would go to church, they had to sit in the very front. They could not speak to anybody else. If they were spoken to, they would get a physical retaliation for that. Those types of factors are definite key indicators that something might be amiss. Not having any pay, not having money, not being able to see the freedoms that even at a basic level most of us would be used to and afforded.
And Sharyn, some of these people involved in this were children. How did they even get into the country?
Okay, so 3 of them came in as adopted children of Mr. Matamata, and that is basically shows how when domestic legislation is no longer responsive to modern society. So it's an intersect of our Adoption Act with the Samoan adoption bill, and the combination of those two created a pathway, and that meant that he was able to adopt up in Samoa, and those children were recognised as his children for immigration and citizenship purposes, and there's not a requirement for checks. So his history wasn't part of that adoption process. And just building on what Cam said, we look back over 20 years and Oranga Tamariki, or our predecessor, knew this family, and we had lots of history with this family, and what were we missing? And it's only as you build awareness, the red flags were there, but you need to know what those red flags are, to know what you're actually looking for. And Cam talked about earlier about hidden victims or hidden crime. Put children in the space, and then put children from another country where there's a lot of cultural layers of expectations, etc., and then where they don't speak English, it's almost impossible for those children to reach out and seek help. So over those times, this case has taught us a lot, hasn't it? And from that, we will build awareness, certainly across the Oranga Tamariki space, and what are we looking at when we go into these families and we start seeing those histories.
So a question for any of you here, thinking about some of the themes here, where we've got piece rate work in the fruit industry. So the work's obviously been outsourced to, effectively, the worker themselves are responsible for their own income through the piece rate nature of fruit picking. We've got people being brought in from a location by a person who's got some linkage to that location. He was a Mātai, he was well known, he had gravitas and mana. And we have people who are not well educated, not familiar with the English language or their rights and responsibilities here, and have got no family connections and no way of reaching out to anybody. Are there some other things that you would look for that would be red flags? What are some of the red flags that we need to start aggregating that, to you 3, in your experience, are screaming out there's a problem here?
I'll start, shall I? Just really briefly, and I think it's been touched on really well by Dennis and others in terms of due diligence, supply chain management, putting responsibility back into the industry to look at these things. I mean, if we're talking about regulatory compliance and we're talking about prevention and really dealing with this problem, it has to start with them and they have to come on board. Prosecutions are but one small kind of arrow that we have in our quiver. Really, it's this collective approach. It's what we're doing right here with everybody that's in this room and wider still with industry leads that will help really have a significant impact in this space.
And so who was benefiting from what Mr. Matamata was doing?
Well, personally, he benefited financially. You know, the quantum of money that we believe he might have made stood in the hundreds of thousands, probably more than that in terms of a conservative approach. But wider still, if you look at industry and what's occurring in the space, arguably you could say many people.
Can I just touch on this? Let me just explain, just in case you need to explain, but human trafficking is a massive business. It is estimated that next to drugs and firearms trafficking is the most profitable for organized crime. And going beyond human trafficking, modern slavery is a massive business because businesses either directly, knowingly or otherwise, they benefit from that kind of exploitation. So we are, in a way, fighting with something that is extremely profitable. And just to put things into context, in many countries, for being caught with illegal firearms or even drugs, illegal drugs, you're going to be punished for much, or your punishment is going to be much higher than for being found to traffic a human being. And if you put that into context, also the fact that it's so much more difficult to prove that you have trafficked a human being, that really, I think, sets the scene for where we are and where we should be. And one other comment in relation to training and what kind of the spotting the signs, the red flags. And it has been happening globally, different factors. So from training the law enforcement, because someone might have worked in a police force or other forms of law enforcement for a really long time, spotting the signs of human trafficking, especially when the victim does not come to you and say, I am a victim, it's very difficult. Training the judiciary, because we cannot forget that ultimately the judges who make decisions, and this is again upholding the fact that this very complex case before the judge was found, it was successful. And many cases elsewhere have not been successful for very reason that often the judiciary, the justices, they're not quite familiar with the complexity of human trafficking. Very recently, European Court of Human Rights found in favour of 2 victims who were put in charge and prosecuted and found guilty in the UK. UK that has had this legislation for much longer time for cannabis cultivation. So it's a question of whether human trafficking victims should be prosecuted, should be punished for offences, including criminal offences they might have conducted while they were under the influence of a trafficker. So it's still a work in progress. In many airlines around the world, the airline staff are being now these days routinely trained in spotting the signs of whether someone might be a human trafficking victim. Because it's not that human trafficking victims, because we often see those images of trucks in Europe, right, where they've been hidden and a lot of them very recently die in the process. But a lot of human trafficking victims travel by air. So they could be literally passing us, maybe not these days because we do not travel international much, but imagine back in those days when we could, when they are one of the persons sitting next to us. And airline staff these days is routinely trained to spot the signs of the behavior of that person and person sitting next to them, whether there might be an indication that the person might be a trafficking victim. And they're also trained in a sense of, and this is in relation to the public, if the public identify, rather than approaching the person directly, which can put that person in danger, notify the authorities and let them deal with the situation. So obviously there's lots of learning to be done for all of us, because ultimately all of us contributing or can stop this from happening.
And I think too, to your point about multiple red flags, Sharyn, as well, is there are multiple red flags, sometimes seemingly unrelated to each other, and then multiple controls that are failing. and yet there isn't sort of a single aggregation point that's building a bigger and bigger red flag and saying this is definitely a problem, we definitely need to go after it. Now look,
can I just say, I think one of the strengths that's come out of the Matamata case has been the power in interagency approaches.
Great.
And in civil society, etc. Because we could have legislation, but modern slavery legislation will still require people to report. And so it, if everyone waits for that sort of golden arrow, we've got people still coming to harm. And that interagency approach, civil society, public, etc. And this case was without even Oranga Tamariki at the table before that. That partnership between police and Immigration New Zealand just shows the strength that comes. And that's bringing those red flags all together.
Those key data points, I agree. And it extends into the procurers too, the business community. Who is buying these services and what are the controls that they should be highlighting to the agencies if needed. So look, we've got a couple of minutes for questions, and I certainly think it's worth grabbing some questions. We've got some roving mics somewhere around. Oh, here comes, in fact, I've got one here. I can bring to you directly.
Hi, I'm Natalia Milne from Zespri. I'm really interested in, when we're working with victims, trying to compel people to come forward. Earlier we talked about liberation can actually result in worse circumstances for people, and we are seeing this in our supply chain. So I'm just interested in how we can work collaboratively to protect victims, to enable them to speak out, knowing that their circumstances will not end badly for them, and that is a reality of what we're dealing with every day.
Good question.
Yeah, look, it's a very, very live point, and I think we saw it on the Survivor story where they were saying, look, the one message you need to get across is that you don't get penalised by coming forward. And that's exactly right, and it's where we all need to collectively be. And, the plan of action that we've been talking about, the approach that we're looking at from an interagency perspective and from an MB drive is to try and really increase the messaging, really, out into the wider communities and industries that if you are a victim, you can come forward. We will not look to disadvantage you by doing that. Really, we're trying to aim at the people that are doing this to you as opposed to you yourself. So I think that is in hand, it's in process, we are working there. We've got a way to go, but it is a very live issue for us and something that we're trying to build to.
And there's some key themes coming out too, Cam, in terms of outreach, even from our victim. I was talking about I had no one to go to. If there was a migrant worker kind of outreach centre, it would have been very helpful.
Yes, so for those that may or may not be aware, and it was touched on through the Migrant Exploitation Initiative by, I think, Minister Wood, there is a new initiative coming out around mid this year that is aligned to the $50 million exercise to increase awareness and addressing exploitation in New Zealand. Exploitation, as Natalia correctly identifies, is a continuum from labour market issues right through to trafficking. Within that, there will be a pathway of a visa for exploited migrants to follow. And that is one area. For trafficking victims, there is another visa pathway that is available to them, and with that is the potential wraparound of a holistic all-of-government kind of health, education services to allow them to get on their feet and be protected.
And Cam, you could argue that that's money well spent by New Zealand, because by issuing work permits, our economy gets the benefit of those workers being productive and adding value to the economy. So it's not much to wrap a bit of, I suppose, pastoral care around those people who we're benefiting from effectively.
Absolutely.
Yeah, sorry, Natalia.
No, I just wanted to add, and so this is really, what we do at the national level makes a difference. And this is really touches on that victim-centered approach. So we're looking from a victim perspective, what is it that would protect the victim from being further traumatized and victimized through the process itself, which unfortunately happens. And if you look globally what happens at national level, at the domestic levels, those arrangements differ. So let me use the example of Australia, which do also have the bridging visa, but unfortunately it's been tied to whether the victim cooperates with the authorities. And obviously from a point of view prosecution, you want the victim to cooperate, but as we already touched on, it's not always necessarily the lack of will from the victim not to cooperate. So is that leading us to fair outcomes? Maybe not. And there's another aspect to it, depending on where the person might be coming from. So let me use the example of a sex work. In some countries, sex work is illegal. So imagine a situation where someone is trafficked for the purpose of sexual exploitation in another country, let's say New Zealand, where sex work is not illegal. But the moment the person is, let's say, extradited to their home country, they're actually gonna be prosecuted for the fact they work in sex industry, even though they were victims of human trafficking. So there are things we can do at the national level, and this is definitely the right direction that our government has taken to ensure the victim-centered approach. But we also have to think about elsewhere, what's happening elsewhere in the world, and if that person, victim of human trafficking, is expelled or returns to their home country, they still may be prosecuted for something they unwillingly committed.
I've got time for one more question. Great.
Hi, I'm Susan Mayava from the Fairfield Trust. I lived in Samoa for a few years, so I'm using that knowledge just to ask this question. When workers are sent to New Zealand, the expectation is that they will send money back to their family. Was this happening in this case? Was Matamata sending money back or not? And if not, is that actually a red flag, and could there be education not just in New Zealand but in other countries like Samoa to say, when things like this happen, if maybe your family member doesn't send back money or you have feelings something's wrong, say something?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So one of the big sells and the reasons they wanted to come to New Zealand was to be able to help their families and send money back. To answer your question, no, the money didn't go back. There was maybe one or two occasions where a small amount of money might have been sent or provided for a funeral, but nowhere near in anybody's kind of books.
And did that not raise red flags there?
So, not really. It's one of the things that we're looking at more collectively and closing the loop, not only raising education and awareness in New Zealand, but with our Pacifica brothers and sisters as well. And this is an ongoing kind of piece of work for us, not only us, but OT and a number of other government agencies, MFAT being but one. But it is a interesting point.
And just to add to that, the minor, the youngest child, he actually believed money was being sent back. And so he just accepted that. His contact with his biological parents was restricted. So he went for 4 years believing money was going back. So that stopped him also saying anything. And back to, if we think about how do we encourage people to come forward, victims to come forward, there's also the critical point of how then do we respond. And we're already learning with Oranga Tamariki that if we try and interview children with the standard interview without reassuring them that they won't be deported or sent back, because that's what hangs over them. And this is, in this situation, this is what happens. So there's masses of layers of control that occur which prevent them from actually coming forward, and hence 24 years of harm.
Thank you for that question. So look, it's happening in New Zealand, it's real, this is a big issue, and people like us in this room can stop this, right? We can make a difference. This was 13 people over 24 years. Natalia, you mentioned that, on the numbers, it's probably more like 3,000 humans in New Zealand being treated this way every day, with the sense that they can't get out of it. So the people in this room we can do this, but we need to want to do it, and we are going to need to make some pretty serious changes to how we go about things. Cam, Sharyn and Natalia, thank you very much for joining us, and I'd like to say in particular to Cam and Sharyn, Go you guys for really knocking it out on the park in this case, and good luck as you go. Well done to you.